All right. What is happening, AP Human Geographers? It's Mr. M. We are back to talk a little urban geography. Now, listen, you guys are doing a homework assignment this week, right? So, you're covering this in the textbook, which is not something that I normally ask you all to do. So, when I go through these classic models, I am going to fly. Secondly, um, I am actually going to be taking this presentation and then I'm going to be merging it with a second presentation that I've done previously. So you're going to actually kind of see two versions of Mr. M in two different Cubs hats. Me right now, coming to you from 2021, and then the Mr. Majewski that's from like 2020 or 2019 when I was explaining these other models in a previous video. These models that I'm about to talk about, I usually would have covered in class during my previous seat-based classes, but well, since I'm all virtual now, I'm all e-learning, I need to make a separate video for this little piece. So, what are we going to cover throughout this entire lecture video for this week? And this is obviously the only lecture video that we have for this week. Well, we're going to cover some of these classic urban models. They're really useful to us for explaining the internal structure of cities and really to understand how cities develop and do they develop in patterns? Do they develop in different ways at different times? And the answer to that is yes. And so specifically, folks, you're going to get hit with a laundry list of models. You're going to get hit with bid rent theory. You're going to get hit with something called John Borchert's urban growth stage theory. Those are two that you really just need to know. You don't need to know them in as much detail as some of these others. Then we're specifically going to hit you with three separate classic American city models, one right after the other, because that's how they occurred in our geographic history. Finally, we'll be moving on to some more modern models in the United States and other developed places in North America. And then lastly, we'll look at some foreign city models. So everyone, we've got a ton of good stuff that we are going to hit on today. You need to make sure that you have done the homework assignment prior to this, and you need to add on to the last page of the homework assignment with some of these models that were not included in the homework itself. Okay, let's do it. So we're going to get started right away, and away we go. Okay. So, bid rent theory, you might remember bid rent theory. We've heard it in a previous model, right? It was used really to understand, well, one, the placement of agriculture, right? It really says the price of land versus the activity that is on it varies the further that you move away from the city itself. Well, we use that in agriculture with von Thunen, right? And now we see it emerge again here with the bid rent theory being applied to city use. Now it's a slightly different application and it's really, really simple, all right? So don't get lost here. What bid rent theory says is that the rent or the cost of the land, the further that you get away from the city, becomes less. And so, because of that, there needs to be certain activity in certain zones the further that you get away that'll be the most successful, that'll be the most ideal in order for the profit from those activities to meet the needs of the rent, the cost of the land. So, what that means is right around the CBD, you tend to get a lot of retail. All right. Why? Well, retail tends to, make profit from the sales that are occurring through consumer sales. They can tend to afford, whether it's entertainment, whether it's actual, stores, they can afford to locate there. They can charge prices. They can make a profit that allows them to pay for that rent in that area. Now, you'll notice the distance from the CBD is relatively small, right? So retail need to locate very close to it in order to attract enough people in order to pay those rents, those land costs there. Next up, we have industry and commercial activity. So we start to see businesses, we start to see manufacturing locate in the second zone. Now you'll notice they tend to locate further away from the city itself, right? And that is in order to take advantage of slightly lower rents, land costs for their activity. That means they don't have to focus on making as much of a profit, right? These are industries that tend to not make as much profit as retail, and so they can afford to locate in the next zone out. Then you start to see apartments and single homes as well. Now, apartments tend to be located closer to the CBD for density purposes, right? Folks who need to be located in the city area, maybe cannot afford the single home costs for whatever reason, tend to be located in Zone C, right? You'll notice there is a specific zone for them where it is ideal for those to locate. Separate from retail and industry. You'll notice that our triangle, our line, extends further outward. And then finally, the last zone in the urban bid rent theory is the single houses or the single home zone. You'll see that extends out quite far. And the reason for that is folks that live in single homes are often willing to trade off the distance in order to commute further towards the city. And so it is most affordable for developers to build single family homes in the furthest zones from the city. That's the most profitable. So what we see is a pattern, right? The further you move from the CBD, you see zones of activity that extend outward. Now, they're going to be smaller or larger, right, depending on each individual place. But generally, you'll see retail cluster closest to the CBD because of bid rent theory costs. You'll see industry locate in the second zones, right, from the CBD. You'll see apartments and finally denser housing. And then finally, you'll see less dense housing towards the outer edges. And again, this has to do with the cost of land and the use of the land itself. Alrighty. All in all, let's move it on to our second theory. Again, this is one that you can apply kind of generally to most American cities, and you can easily compare it, right, with other theories that we have learned, like von Thunen, for example. All right, let's talk a little about John Borchart's urban growth stages because this really kind of explains the history of American city growth. Now, most of the other models we focus on the 1900s. Borchart's theory goes back further. And what he basically says is if you look at the history of the United States, even before the United States, but especially once we became a country, we developed our cities based on the energy that was available, based on the transportation that was available, and that led to, and based on critical locations that were needed, and that led to unique spatial patterns. So he divides our growth throughout our history into 5 stages, all right, and he classifies them according to particular words or labels. So he starts with pre 1820. Now, again, you need to know this theory very generally. I don't think you need to know it line by line by line. But it pretty much makes sense. In pre 1820, right, our focus really was on land primarily and acquiring it. We're mostly being powered by human and animal. Transportation networks are very limited, especially on land. And so, as a result, most travel was by river or ocean, even up to that point. And so, where did you see most of our major cities? At seaports, on rivers, or on the coastline. You saw some agricultural villages, but generally the largest cities before 1820 along the coast or on rivers. So you saw Boston and New York and Philadelphia emerge during this time. Then the second stage, Borchardt calls the labor stage. All right, this is when industrialization is just starting to emerge. This would be early stage 2, where the infrastructure is starting to develop. So we start to move our power sources now, right, to water and steam. We improve transportation to now not only include rivers but canals, and thanks to steamboats, right, rivers are more navigable. That means our new cities during this era tend to be located on interior waterways, interior rivers, lakes, and canals that are now accessible. So you start to see Cleveland, you start to see Buffalo and Pittsburgh along the Great Lakes. Then, Borchardt says, stage 3, 1840s to 60s, well, that's our capital stage when we're really starting to get into industrialization. Now we've got improved railroads, we've got better quality that can extend further. Now we start to see locations that are not only lake, river, but also now important rail locations. And Chicago is a great example of that. and the Midwestern cities start to be populated. Then Borchardt extends the fourth stage all the way to the 1920s. This is basically the second era of modern industrialization. Coal, steam, electricity. Now we have steel railroads. We settled not only the Midwest, but the West. And so Dallas, San Francisco, and some of these major Western cities like Seattle are settled during this time. And since then, Borchardt says, we've been in one giant era. The 1920s to present is the information age. This is the era of the gasoline powered combustion engines. That means automobiles and trucks and shipping that are now much, much stronger than ever before. That also means the development of airplanes during this era. Many different types of transportation, not nearly as many hindrances as existed in the past, right? Highways, airports now actually follow cities. Instead of being the reason why cities were located, major ports, now they follow and are built in places where cities are located because of the mobility and globalization we have. This led to the development of places like LA, like Miami, like Phoenix, that had previously been on the periphery of settlement that now could be settled thanks to these advances, especially in transportation. So, Borchardt's theory, 5 stages throughout our history, based almost primarily on the energy sources and the transportation sources we used, and that meant critical locations were located in a pattern from east to west, right, based on the energy and the transportation that was available to us at that time. Great stuff. Now, we're going to focus in on 3 specifically American models. These are models that don't just describe how all American cities evolved. These are models that are specifically talking and predicting how a single city will evolve in the United States. Now, let's get to them. We're going to go back to back to back with 3 models that were predicted by, or that were developed by 3 different people that all talked about the development of Chicago at different times. All right. And we're talking about like decade after decade after decade. So fast. All right. Because I don't need to cover these a lot. They're in the textbook. The concentric zone model is one of the most famous models that was created. And what it does is it says when a city developed in the United States beginning in the early 1900s that it would develop in this kind of pattern. That was based on what was observed at the time in Chicago. It was developed by a guy named E.G. Burgess. And what Burgess said was that you would have the CBD obviously in the center of the historical traditional city. That would have the highest land values. Then, right around that CBD, he said there would be what he called a transition zone. This would be poor residential, maybe the poorest residential zones in the city. This is where the blue collar workers work, the manual laborers work, the folks that are scratching and surviving the most. All right. Oftentimes, this might be areas where recent immigrants are located. Transition, right, from the CBD to other residential areas. And this, again, oftentimes maybe the oldest neighborhoods in the city, now maybe the most dilapidated where the poorest were living. The zone out after that was known as the third ring, the zone of independent workers. Now, these are blue collar workers, but they're slightly more successful. Maybe their previous generation were in the transition zone, and now this new generation, the second generation, has been able to afford to move out. These are newer apartments that are being built, right? Not enough to be able to own single family homes or anything, but newer apartments. And these are workers who can still live close enough to the city to be able to walk to work, right? They don't have to pay for transportation. So they kind of get the best of both worlds, right? So we'd call these kind of emerging middle class zones, independent workers, folks who are slowly starting to gain more success as blue collar workers. Then we start to get to the wealthier zones. All right. Now, what Burgess said in zone 4 is the white collar homes. Now, white collar tend to be middle to upper class homes. These are folks that are not manual laborers. These are folks that are not laborers usually at all. They're generally more office based, right, workers, working and providing services for other within offices, within stores, those sorts of things. So these homes are generally lived in by wealthier groups within the city. They were known as the horse and buggy or streetcar homes. Why? Well, because these were communities where individuals could afford, right, either a horse and buggy to take them into town. Yes, it's still that old of a model, right? Cars aren't even widespread, or streetcars, trolleys that were developed that could take them in, and they could afford to pay for that on a daily basis. So they could afford to live further out. That meant land values were usually more expensive. That meant land plots were usually larger, right? A little more peace, a little more serenity, less pollution, maybe less crime. All right. Now, finally, what you have in the back are the commuters, right? These are the folks who are the wealthiest usually. And they, well, I should say the wealthiest tend to locate in the better residences. Commuters tended to be folks who, if they could afford to do so, would live out in these areas and commute into the city. But most of the time in Burgess's model, this last zone, these folks are so outside of the city, they don't really have daily contact. We don't have like mass transit or anything like that that can bring folks to this, and we don't have cars yet. Now, as trains start to develop, folks can move into these commuter zones and begin to relocate with more, locate into the city with more regularity. Okay, so anyways, that was the Burgess model. We've got our five zones. Again, let's go through some highlights. This was the model that was studied in the 1910s and 1920s in Chicago. You've got those concentric zones. The zones will be different sizes in different cities, depending on the uniqueness, physical factors, things like that. He suggested immigrants lived in the inner zones, and then there was a process where you gradually moved outward. Affluent residents, richer residents tended to move further out. He called it invasion and succession, right? Where poorer groups, often immigrants, would move into the poorer zones, and then they would succeed or follow, right, the middle and wealthier groups as they moved further outward from the city. If you hear invasion and succession, you know they're talking about Burgess's concentric zone. Um, it doesn't really, it assumes, the biggest weakness is that it assumes growth's going to happen concentrically. We know that's not necessarily the case. And we know it can grow in bursts or patches in a particular direction or area. Also, obviously, it doesn't take physical barriers into account. What if you have a lake that your city borders, like Chicago? That's obviously going to prevent your rings from forming over almost half of your city. All right. And so, because of that, we get a second theory that emerges kind of more into the mid to late 1920s. Um, and it stresses the importance of now transportation. So while Burgess is focused on transportation, this second model, named the sector model, right, by Homer Hoyt, really took transportation into much greater account. It saw the growth of various urban activities as expanding along roads, rivers, or train routes. All right. Burgess focused on the significance of the trolley and maybe the railroad as it was slowly starting to emerge. But Hoyt had taken into the development of the automobile, all right, by the time that this theory develops, the 20s and 30s. That's a typo right there. And so Hoyt really is better able to take transportation and see the influence it would have over growth. So, five stages as well. Five sectors. Now, remember, in Hoyt's model, you have the concentric zone, but then you place these sectors over it to really reflect where the growth is happening. So, one is always zone CBD. That's your central business district. That's in the center. Now, look at the rest of the city. You'll notice there are almost like pie-like wedges that go across the city itself. Zone 2, transportation and industry. You're going to have railroads, right? Or maybe roads that go through this entire zone from one end of the city to the other that are going to border the CBD. What that does is it allows industry to cluster in this area, usually heavy industry clusters in this area, and you have jobs that then extend from one end of the city to the other, but you'll see they can still border the CBD, right? So the business activity can connect with the industrial. Transportation is really the major hub in this sector. Then you're going to get low class residential housing that's usually going to work in a wedge or a sector directly adjacent to the heavy industry and transportation. Remember, these are the lowest income workers. They're the ones that can't afford to live far from the city. They can't afford the transportation costs. So they're going to generally live in the lowest quality housing, and it's going to be located in a sector that parallels where the industry and transportation have located. Where are you going to see the middle class residential? Well, you're going to usually see that on the other side of the transportation and industry sector, right? So on the left side of the screen here, and in various other parts of the city, right, beyond the low class residential. Finally, check this out. In the sector model, you'll notice the high class residential, they tend to have their own sector that goes directly into the CBD. That means they have transportation routes that allow them to access the CBD through their own sector without having to access middle class, low class, or other sectors along the way. Hoyt's sector model into the 20s and 30s, better integrated transportation into growth, right? And it also responded to some of the criticisms of Burgess's concentric zone. Remember, growth is now more pie shaped in terms of its direction. And he said, obviously, you are going to see that growth from the core towards the edges of the city, especially with the high class residential. All right. The sector model obviously argues, hey, the CBD isn't as important as it once was because now transportation routes are determining where the growth is, not the CBD. And let's move it on. Alrighty, and let's move it on to the third model that we need to understand. Now, again, just like the sector model was used in Chicago in the late 20s and 30s, just like it had been used to describe the growth in Chicago when Burgess was around in the 20s, now we get a third model, multiple nuclei, and it's also describing the city of Chicago, and it's describing the changes that start to take place in 1940s. So, what is the model? Well, this was a model that was able to take really the significance of automobiles into account for the first time. Because only by the 1940s were automobiles so widespread that they were affecting city growth. Up until then, it was usually other types of transportation that were influencing the growth more. This model is developed by Harris and Ullman. These are two geographers that work together, and they hypothesized, hey, if the CBD was less important under the sector model, we assume it's going to become even less important as time goes by with the development of the auto. And that's exactly what happens. And so, in their model, known as the multiple nuclei model, the CBD that used to be dominant for activity has lost its clout even further. Is it still important? Absolutely, but nowhere near as important to activity as it used to be in previous generations. It's not the nucleus of the modern city. In fact, what you see, they argued, is multiple nuclei begin to emerge, and you'll have an airport potentially pop up in one area of the city. You may have a seaport. You may have a high tech, business area that emerges, right, in an area. Maybe a business park, right, emerges in an area where a lot of high rises want to locate. And so the entire point here is because automobiles are so widespread, the activity doesn't need to be clustered in the CBD. Developers know that, and they begin to almost create multiple nodes of activity within the city to attract activity, people, money. All right. Now, this reflects the idea of decentralization. The city is becoming more and more decentralized. It's leading to more suburbs and housing communities towards the outer edges. It leads to what we call more sprawl, all right, where cities just go on and go on and go on, seemingly without any end in development. Um, so here, decentralization starts to occur, right? And we're seeing multiple different nodes of activity that are growing in importance. By the way, the nuclei, the different parts of the city, may not even be connected at all. Yes, they're part of the larger urban area, but they don't necessarily always rely on one another for activity, for connections. And so it's almost like the city loses some of its connectivity at the same time. This is a great example of a multiple nuclei. Do you see? Now we have a lot more zones, right? We have the CBD still as number one, but you'll notice we have a number of different wholesales, like light manufacturing is number two. Then we have the regular low, medium, and high class housing, but you'll notice it's much more spread out. It's much further than the CBD than it's ever been. And then take a look at 7, 8, and 9. All right. First off, look at 6, heavy manufacturing. You see how it's actually not even connected to the CBD. It's turned into its own node and area of the city that is attracting activity on its own. Look at 7. That's an outlying business district that's so far removed from the rest of the city, it might as well be its own entity. And do you notice? Then you start to see 8 and 9. You start to see residential suburbs pop up closer to those nodes, essentially based off the activity in those nodes, no longer connected to the CBD. All right. So again, we're stressing the importance of multiple nodes of activity. Ports, airports, universities are another great example of nuclei within a city. Amusement parks can be, sports stadiums, right, can be as well. We have a lot of different nodes or focuses of activity within a city compared to the old traditional CBD where it all used to be clustered. All right. Now, hey, check it out. The reality is that none of these models, none of these three accurately describe any American city today. Instead, we see value in that they tell us how cities existed at particular periods. So if you look at a city like Chicago, you can see examples of all three of these types of growth at different places based on what emerged during what era. You can do that with a lot of American cities from the 18 and 1900s, right? And really see how the growth occurred, maybe according to multiple patterns, depending on the different decades. Okay, now I'm going to jump over and I'm going to add in a bunch of the information from the other slides. So
Populations of cities and LDCs, they've been surging. Urbanization has been occurring. Migration from rural areas is occurring. There are massive NIRs in these places, and so naturally, as a result, our fastest growth is happening in LDC cities today. Of course, this is a massive result of changes to the economy as these countries go into stage 2 or stage 3 of economic development. Then, of course, we start to see movement to cities. The poor tend to live in the suburbs. They tend to live in the outer edges of cities. It's a lot like Europe. The rich actually live in the CBD, again, modeling European cities, and the exact opposite of American ones. These cities often struggle to provide jobs and housing, right? The services are usually especially overtaxed. I mean, if American cities can't provide services any longer effectively, can you imagine what the situation is in a lot of LDC cities, right? Squatter settlements have popped up. Again, sometimes called slums. We prefer squatter settlements. A squatter is somebody who settles somewhere without legal permission. And of course, oftentimes crime is on the rise as well as pollution in many of these LDC cities. Again, look at this map here of it looks like Brazil to me, yes. And what you're seeing here is it looks like Rio. And you're noticing that the wealthiest folks are actually lived in the CBD or in the center of the city. And then the further you get outward, the lower the income levels. Again, a great example of how LDC cities and European cities tend to be different than American ones. All right, speaking of LDC cities, here's what's interesting about them. There are really kind of three types of cities, or I guess what we should say is a lot of these LDC cities, especially in Latin America and Africa, developed in a series of stages or waves. First, there was the pre-colonial stage. These were the European cities that popped up before Europeans. LDC cities that popped up before Europeans ever arrived. Very few of these exist in the world today. Those that did exist back then were often centered around religion and politics. They were completely unindustrialized when they popped up. So again, we're talking about places like what will later be Mexico City, right? Aztecs and Incas. Some of these massive native tribes who built these massive cities, they did so without any sort of industrialization. And so, the cities reflected that. They were popped out for religious or political reasons. Then, of course, we have the colonial cities. Now, these were cities that popped up or developed when Europeans were colonizing an area. These generally copy European cities, since that's the folks who designed them and built them. They reflect the layout and the architecture of the colonizing country. So if the English colonized, they developed the English model, and you saw English architecture and buildings. If it was French, it was the French building styles. All right. Government buildings were usually laid out in a grid pattern with a plaza or square. In a plaza or square, and then various plazas and squares and fountains were created around that area, which kind of developed like a grid-like pattern with squares in between. Again, very common in European cities, and therefore very common in cities that Europeans colonized as well. Then, of course, we have the post-colonial independent city. These are cities that developed or really grew after Europeans had decolonized, which means left these areas that had been under their control. These are cities that are rapidly growing today, and many of the time these cities are unprepared. The country that is now independent may not have the resources that the European country did, and so therefore you tend to see massive growth at a rate faster than the city can provide housing or services to meet it. As a result, squatter settlements often form in the outskirts of these cities. Regardless of where you're at, these tendencies, these eras, were pretty commonplace. So we have some LDC models that you need to know. There are 3 of them. They attempt to explain similarities, but especially differences with North American and European cities. We call it the Latin American city model, we call it the African city model, and then there is the Asian or Southeast Asian city model. Let's get to the Latin American forward. Hey, this is the foreign model that I have predicted would be most likely to pop up on an FRQ. I think there's very likely we're going to get one in the next few years. I could easily see it being compare Ford's model to an American equivalent model. So this is definitely something that you want to be familiar with, you want to be aware of. All right. So we're going to pick it up with peripheral model. Peripheral is really just multiple nuclei. Only the difference is the various nuclei are connected around the outer edge of the city by a beltway or a ring road. All right. So what this leads to oftentimes is a lot more sprawl because it almost encourages edge cities and suburbs to pop up even further from the city center. And these places oftentimes then might actually even develop suburbs of their own as the CBD becomes less and less significant in the center city as time goes by. By the way, galactic model and periphery are the same thing. So this is a sample of a modern galactic city. Do you see how it kind of has this beltway, right? This freeway system that goes all the way around it. And you notice how a lot of the new developments cluster along the beltway, right? They almost follow the path of the beltway. It's almost encouraging or motivating edge cities to pop up. And remember, edge cities are cities that have a huge majority of office space and homes. And so it encourages generally wealthier folks to move out to that area and to set up offices or businesses there so they can avoid having to travel to the CBD altogether. So again, you're seeing shopping centers and multiple nuclei develop here. You're seeing industrial suburbs over here, which are nuclei. You're seeing theme parks, which are it's its own nuclei. I mean, we have a great example of one with Disneyland here. You're seeing a high-tech industrial area that's its own suburb and its own, edge city or edge area as well. So again, you're just seeing the denuclearization of this city as it spreads out, and oftentimes it's scattered around the beltway or the ring road that encircles the city itself. So periphery and galactic model would be the same models. Now, what's this urban realms? Urban realms is when those edge cities that we just talked about become so significant and so independent of the CBD, of the central city, that they're almost independent completely and no longer connected to it in any way. Each realm or edge city develops its own suburbs. Since these are suburbs that are developed around the edge city, they're edge suburbs, and we call them exurbs. So literally, it's like your suburbs are developing suburbs, and your edge cities are developing suburbs, and it gets to the point where each of the edge cities is so kind of large and significant itself that it's no longer dependent or necessary for it to be connected to the central city any longer. Truly, each edge city becomes its own realm, almost like its own world, no longer connected or dependent like it used to be. So again, multiple nuclei, you see the nuclei of the city spread out, the CBD becomes less important. Periphery, galactic city, it's literally spreading out around that ring road that exists. And then urban realms is when the edge cities that have formed have developed exurbs, and it becomes so significant that they're truly completely disconnected from the central city even more. All right. Obviously, urban realms leads to massive sprawl. A great example of urban realms, they say, is San Francisco. In addition to that, Los Angeles is oftentimes viewed as one, or I should say Southern California, because a lot of the edge cities around LA have gotten to be large enough and significant enough where they really have formed their own cities and do not have to be, people there are not really dependent on the CBD of the central city at all. Speaking of changes in cities, remember, in developed countries, we notice suburbanization, especially in the United States. Now we have massive numbers of folks moving from ethnic neighborhoods into suburbs. Usually, again, this has a lot to do with automobiles and roads. They're chasing what's called the American dream, which means home ownership. And for many, many decades, the goal of many Americans was to own this home in the suburbs. I do think that's changing because of gentrification and other factors. Please remember there's a much smaller stream occurring, but you need to be aware of it. It's called counter-urbanization, and it's happening in the United States. It's where folks who used to live in an urban or area or suburb have relocated back to rural places again. They like the quiet, they like the peace, they like the serenity, they like the ideal of a rural, small town or rural environment. Also, the cost of land is much lower there. So if you are retiring, you're on a fixed income, it's especially appealing to you. Additionally, there's a slow pace of life there. You get to benefit, you get to be closer to nature and the natural environment. And yet, because of technology, you can still be connected to the internet. You can still contact your friends via phone, right? And you still have access to cable. And so you still have a lot of high-tech connections, even while you're still living out in that rural place. That's counter-urbanization. Don't confuse it with suburbanization. Both are happening. This is happening a lot more than this in the United States today. The very last slide are general rules. Well, hey, MDCs usually are the most urbanized. North America and Europe have the highest levels of urbanization anywhere. But LDCs are actually urbanizing at a faster rate, so they're catching up. That's happening pretty much across the board in all LDCs. Latin America is the most industrialized and urbanized of the LDC regions. Sub-Saharan Africa is the least industrialized and urbanized. Most Americans live in urban areas, about 70%, whether they live in the city, 30%, or in the suburbs, 40%. Most Americans live in one of those two places. Okay, so Latin American model is developed by a geographer last name Ford. And it tries to explain how Latin American cities have developed up until today in comparison or in contrast to American cities. So, first off, a Latin American city is going to have a central business district. But in addition to that central business district, and that's going to be a traditional one, all right? It's going to look a lot like you would see in Europe or the United States. But in addition to that central business district, and oftentimes attached to it, you're going to have a market as well. This is usually an open air market. It could be like a farmer's market or a bazaar or an area like that in the center of the city in which goods are being bought and sold informally by folks who are generally making it at home and then selling their wares to those who come to buy them. So you'll have your traditional CBD. At the same time, you will have this open market area in a lot of cities in Latin America as well. And then it really starts to get interesting. Right around the CBD and this market area is essentially a ring or a circle that's called the zone of maturity. That's where wealthy and middle class folks tend to cluster. So again, very different than American cities. They're going to cluster around the CBD and market as opposed to the outer edges like in the US. In addition to that, part of that zone of maturity, as it's called, and you do need to know this terminology, is going to be gentrified areas, gentrified homes, that are specially rebuilt and cater to wealthy individuals living in that city. Then, You will have what are called zones of accretion that surround the zone of maturity. Zones of accretion are usually lower class homes that extend outward from the zone of maturity, really kind of all the way towards the outer edges of the city itself. Then, on the outskirts of those, you're going to see what are called the periferico. These are the peripheral zones. These are the squatter settlements. They're in orange on this map. And they form an outer ring along the outer edge of the city. This would be where suburbs would be in the United States. Instead, you have these squatter settlements, these slums that are located in Latin American cities. Now, what's interesting is the periferico, the slums, the squatter settlements, they have what are called zones of disamenity. They almost look like fangs, if you ask me. And they connect to the market zone in the center of the city. So there will always be these slum corridors or these shantytown or these periferico squatter settlement corridors that allow folks living in the periphery to be able to still access the center market. They will actually usually cut through the zone of maturity, the wealthier areas. Oftentimes these wealthier areas, therefore, are gated communities or are somehow walled off or blocked out from the zones of disamenity. Then, that right there is like totally different than American cities. Then, you have this other really unique feature in Latin American cities. You have this cool spine, we call it. It's usually an industrial and a commercial spine. It's basically retail and industry that are all clustered together. If they're not located in the CBD, they form like a spine, which is like a straight line that cuts across the city. And it usually ends in an area that is like an edge city-like place that they'll call a commercial and retail mall area. That's on the outskirts of the city. So the spine connects to the mall, which connects to the CBD in the center. All of that is where a lot of your business and retail, especially your high-end business and retail, is going to locate. And directly around that spine is actually the wealthiest residences because they want to be as close as possible to the retail, to the business, to the commercial as they can be. Again, these are almost always gated and walled off communities that are completely separated from the rest of the city. If you notice, the wealthiest folks that live along the spine do not have any direct contact whatsoever with the slums, with the squatter settlements, with the periphery, right? Interestingly enough, you just don't see that. Oftentimes, on the opposite side of the city from where the spine is located, the commercial spine as they call it, you're going to see industrial spine or industrial park that has a lot of factories in it. And a lot of maybe lower skilled workers are going to be working in that side of the city, whereas the wealthier folks and maybe the more high skilled workers are going to be working in the commercial spine, the black area surrounded by the blue. So a lot going on here, right, with this setup. You realize it's kind of hub and spoke. You got your CBD market, you got the wealthier communities around there, you got your richest, most elite communities that surround the spine, the commercial spine. You're going to have your periphery on the outsides, and then what are called zones of disamenity that connect to the periphery to the center of the city. Latin American model, know it. All right, that's the only thing I can tell you. African city model's a little bit different. All right, this is pretty interesting. Remember, African cities are the fastest growing in the world. Now, here right away is what makes African cities so different. They have what are called 3 different CBDs. They're going to have what's called the colonial CBD. This was usually the center of the country when the European colonizer was in that place. Usually the buildings look European. The architecture does. And these were usually government sites, government buildings, where the governor would have lived and where political decisions were made. So there's a traditional colonial CBD. Then there's what's called your regular CBD that would look like it would in Europe or the US. That's going to have commerce, that's going to have banks and finance. It's going to look very similar to a US CBD. Then you're going to have that market or that bazaar again. You're going to have a mass market area where all goods are bought or sold. All 3 of these CBDs are going to connect to one another, right? You're going to get the grid-like setup in the colonial one, right? You're going to get your traditional CBD, right? That's yellow in this image. And then you're going to get the market, right? With all the open stalls, open spaces for products to be bought and sold. Ethnic and mixed neighborhoods then extend outward from the CBD. Please note that in African cities, they don't really cluster by wealth level, they cluster by ethnicity. So ethnicities and tribes will live amongst one another. And so there'll be ethnic neighborhoods that surround the CBD, different tribes living amongst one another. Then you'll start to get into a mix of ethnic and mixed neighborhoods, which are about 50-50, right? Where you'll still have ethnic neighborhoods, but now some of them are going to be mixed ethnicity. And then finally, as you on the other side of that zone, you're going to get mining and manufacturing. Remember, a lot of African countries are still using natural resources in order to develop. So mining and manufacturing tends to be located towards the outer edge of the city. And then surrounding all of that, you get the slums. You get the informal satellite townships. Those are shanty towns. Those are squatter settlements. So just like Latin America, we see the squatter settlements in African cities as well, because people are coming faster than the services can keep up. By the way, North African cities don't have a particular model, but you should know they usually have a mosque that separates them from other African cities because they are Islamic. It's usually dominant. It usually dominates the cityscape, so you can see it from far away. There'll be Muslim religious architecture in North African cities, religious buildings. Smaller mosques will stand out. Remember, there will be small or non-facing windows in many buildings in North African cities, so that when a woman is in privacy and she's not fully covered in her clothing, then she's out of the watchful eyes of men who might be peeping, I guess, for lack of a better term. That keeps up with the principles of Islam. And again, you're going to have market bazaars in Islamic cities as well. I hate to use this stereotype, but a little bit like the movie Aladdin. Remember where there's that market where goods can be bought and sold. All right, finally, the Asian city model. McGee is the geographer. So the Asian city model is a little bit different. It's not a circle. It's a fan-like shape, right? Instead of a traditional CBD, because so many of these Asian cities are producing goods that are being shipped to the United States or other places, the traditional CBD in most Asian cities is actually a port. It's actually a zone that can be used to export goods to foreign countries for trade. So that takes the role of the CBD in most Asian cities, especially newer ones. Then, connecting to the port, you're going to have commercial sectors. Those are sectors where businesses are allowed to locate. There's almost always what's called a Western commercial sector. That's going to be for American and European businesses to locate there. Those businesses can locate there. They can use workers in that city and oftentimes pay them less than they would in their home country. And then the rule is all of the products that are usually made in those factories, in those businesses, then have to be shipped out of the port back to other countries to be sold. The idea here is the Asian country is able to take advantage of the American businesses. The American businesses set up there. They employ workers from the home country, but the home country doesn't have to worry about their inferior products not being able to compete with the American or European ones. In addition to that, there will be a government commercial sector. That would mean sectors there where the government of that country might have industries it's controlling located there, like with China, or it just might mean areas where businesses from that country are allowed to locate. Again, that's going to be connected to the port zone as well. And then finally, you're going to get what's called a foreign port, all right, as well. Foreign port areas are usually for companies that are not located in the United States or Europe, but are located in other Asian countries, so that there's a spot for Asian businesses to locate as well. So again, you're not going to have the traditional CBD. You're going to have a port. It's going to result in a fan-shaped like city setup. And once again, you're going to have various commercial zones, a Western zone, a government zone, and oftentimes you will have a foreign company zone or an alien commercial zone as well for businesses that are not located in your country. Then, extending outward, what you're noticing is the residences usually kind of tend to follow an American pattern. What we mean is You start to see middle class residential zones the further you get away from the commercial area. Then you start to see the newer suburbs around the outer edges of the city. Now, here's what's different. In Asian cities, new suburbs are often built with squatter settlements in between them. So, in the same zone that you'll have new suburbs, you might also end up having squatter settlements as well mixed in. The highest wealth levels in an Asian city usually cluster near the government zone, since a lot of those wealthy people in that country work in industries that are supported by the government or protected by it. They tend to cluster nearby those locations. Finally, really unique to the Asian city, you're going to get that market gardening zone, right? Asian populations tend to value fresh fruits and vegetables on a yearly basis. So there's a market gardening zone that allows folks to have those market gardens and be able to get their fresh crops to the market as quickly as possible to meet that constant demand that exists. Finally, there may be a high-tech zone or some sort of industrial park that's technically outside of the traditional city area. It's a lot like a suburban mall or a suburban edge city. It's got a lot of industry, high-tech areas, maybe even retail that clusters there. You see a lot of modern high-rises and buildings located in that place. Again, a lot of times Asian cities tend to want to copy or emulate American ones, so they do deal with sprawl a little bit more than Europe and other LDC areas. All right, that's it. Mr. M signing off.